All right, everyone. Well, welcome again. We are going to go ahead and get started while people continue to trickle in. Please note we are recording this call today. So everyone, my name is Sam DeLapp, and I'm the program coordinator at North Carolina Campus Engagement. And on behalf of the entire North Carolina Campus Voting Coalition, we are so excited to welcome you to the March Primary Campus Activation Day call. Today is an amazing opportunity for campus staff, faculty, and administrators to learn about exactly what's going on in North Carolina voting and election law and what actionable steps you can take today to prepare your campus for the March primaries. Young people today, as we all know, face a multitude of barriers that prevent them from reaching ideal voter registration and turnout rates, namely a lack of information and resources to meet those necessary deadlines and requirements. But as campus staff, faculty, administrators, and organization partners, you are in unique positions to provide this information directly to students you serve to empower them to vote. So that being said, North Carolina voting and election landscape looks very different this year than it has in the past, especially for college students. And as you look forward to how the 2024 elections will impact your campus, we want to make sure that you have access to the full scope of requirements and deadlines, updates, and resources that will help you on that journey to increasing student voter engagement. So before we get started, I would like to thank all of the partner organizations of the North Carolina Campus Voting Coalition that made this event possible. On the next slide. The Campus Voting Coalition is an alliance of organizations committed to providing education, resources, and support to North Carolina campuses to increase voter participation and civic engagement. So thank you to All In, Campus Vote Project, Civic Influencers, Common Cause North Carolina, Equality North Carolina, NC Campus Engagement, the NC Conservation Network, Vote Writers, and You Can Vote. So on the next slide, the agenda for the day is up on the screen, and you should have received it in your email communications leading up to today as well. Note that the same link will be used for the entire call throughout the day, so if you do need to hop off for whatever reason, you can use that same link to get back on for the remainder of the sessions. So you will first hear from Adam Steele from the North Carolina State Board of Elections about current North Carolina voting and election laws. Then Campus Voting Coalition partners will be presenting their resources that you can bring to your campus. And finally, you'll jump into a session with NCA&T State University as well as Elizabeth City State University to get insight into how they have developed really effective and strategic voter mobilization tactics. And at the end of that portion, we will open it up to you to share about what your campus is doing for student voters, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A in between. Note, this is a long call, and so if you need to take a moment to turn off your camera, stretch your legs before jumping back in, take care of yourself, do what you need to do, and just make sure that you're comfortable. So for our first session of the day, we are thrilled to be joined by Adam Steele, Associate General Counsel at the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Mr. Steele will be sharing about the North Carolina voting and election law changes that you need to know for the upcoming election season. So Adam, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully I do it right again. Is that showing presenter view or is it showing?
We're looking at presenter view right now.
Okay. How about now?
There you go.
I think I'm doing it right.
Yeah, that looks good.
Yeah, although it's not for me. Sorry about this. Let's try it again. We'll figure it out. Okay. So thank you again for having me here. I'm glad to be here. Like Sam said, my name is Adam Steele. I'm the Associate General Counsel at the State Board of Elections. And so just briefly about me, went to NC State for undergrad and Campbell for law school. So been to a couple of different schools here in North Carolina, and I'm from North Carolina too. I'm from Cary. So I grew up here, and elections has been something that even as a high school student and certainly as a college student, I was all about. So glad to be here and glad to talk about the different changes in the law that the students might be running up against or encountering if they're an experienced voter or if they're a new voter for the first time in the elections this year. So The three things I'm really going to focus on today are just some key issues. And so one is photo ID. And even though technically it's not new this year, it's going to be new for almost everybody in the state. So the second thing is going to be some pointers for college voters, and this is mainly going to be focused on just the registration. And so their options and some considerations they need to take into account whenever they are registering to vote or updating the registration too. And the third thing is an elections omnibus bill that was enacted last year, and it added a bunch of quite a few changes to the election laws that started this year, so that most of them became effective on January 1st. And so again, if there are experienced voters who are college students, there may be certain things that are different now for them, and even if they're new voters, it still might be different just because they might have already known uh, what the laws and deadlines were before. So we'll go over a few key points about that are more important to college voters than maybe your other voters. So first off, the new photo ID requirements. Uh, like I mentioned, uh, technically the photo ID law went into effect last year, and so we have gone through one election. It was the municipal elections with the photo ID laws. The law was enacted in 2018, and then through various court cases, it's been on hold since then. And then last April, the North Carolina Supreme Court reversed the injunction, said, all right, go ahead and proceed. The law is fine. And so that allowed for us to, one, it put the state board and the county boards of elections in a kind of a time crunch to get ready. But it also meant that we had the municipal elections to go ahead and implement the photo ID law and help us work out some of the kinks. And so now, we're even more prepared from the state board and county board level for the implementing the photo ID laws for the primary and general elections this year. So when voting in the 2024 primary and general election, and I'll say these two things, the next two sentences I'm going to say, we include these in basically every communication that we put out. And it's because it's really important that everybody knows, especially the first part, if they're voting in person, all voters will be asked to show photo ID when they vote in person. So the way that works, and I'll talk about this more in depth a bit, but basically when a voter shows up at the voting site, there's either going to be probably a sign or a greeter who are going to let them know whenever they go inside, they're going to be asked to show photo ID. Now, absentee voters, and those are voters who are going to be voting by mail. And so absentee voters must include a copy of their photo ID when voting by mail. So that's the other thing. Even if you vote by mail, even though you're not showing your ID so your picture can be compared, you're still going to need to include a copy of your ID. Now that, even so, everybody's going to be asked to show a photo ID or include a copy of their ID. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how voters without IDs can still vote, though. And so that's a key point to remember, is that even if you don't have an ID, you could still qualify for an exception. There might still be a reason. Even if you show up to vote and you don't have your ID with you, you can still vote. So I'll go over some of the just scenarios where that might happen. And just final one point here about this link that I have here at the bottom. I can't say enough just how comprehensive the State Board website is in terms of information. So if you're looking for resources for your students, especially, you can just go to ncsb.gov, and it's all broken down by area, like either registration or voting. There's a lot of data there in case students are interested in that. But really, for voter ID, if you go to the home page, and scroll down a little bit, there's a big panel you click on, go to the voter ID page, and it has a lot of resources there and really a lot of answers to a lot of questions too. So that's certainly, if your students have any questions about voter ID, I would direct them to that page. So under the law, there are a lot of acceptable IDs. They're all spelled out in the statute. And so I'm going to talk about a few of them that are probably more commonly held by students. And So this is just a big smattering of all the different ones. But so the first one is a North Carolina driver's license, non-operator ID, or a no-fee ID. So really, these are some form of ID that comes from the North Carolina DMV. Now I know for students nowadays, I think a driver's license might be less common than it was before. I know when I was a student in high school, I was I had to change high schools around the time when I was taking driver's ed, and it meant I got delayed and I couldn't get my license right when I turned 16. I remember that really annoyed me, but that doesn't seem to be as much of a thing that students are as focused on now. So it may be that they don't have a driver's license, but uh, the vast majority of voters are going to be presenting their North Carolina driver's license. And so, just one point of emphasis on that, the card can't be expired by more than 1 year whenever they show up to vote. Unless there is an exception if you're 65 or older and your driver's license was unexpired when you turn 65. The one thing I'll point out on the no fee ID, there is information for that. If a student goes to the NCDMV website, there is information there. Pretty much anybody who I believe is 17 or older can get a no fee ID. So the next one that students might have would be if your students are from other states, which can be fairly common. And so it can be a driver's license or a non-operator ID issued by another state or DC or some territory commonwealth, but only if the voter's registration was within 90 days of the election. So just to give that as an example, say you have a student who's from another state, they're from Virginia. Even though they've been here since the summer, we'll say they're freshmen, they started in August of last year. If they register to vote now in January, that's within 90 days of the primary election. So they would be able to use their out of state driver's license as their photo ID whenever they show up to vote here for the primary. But looking ahead, though, for the general election, that's more than 90 days from January. So that would be an ID that they could use in the primary, but by the time they got to the general election, they wouldn't be able to use that ID card. So they would need to get something new, either a North Carolina driver's license or some of the other ones that we're going to be that I'm going to be talking about. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And once again, the expiration date is something that matters for this type of ID as well. All right, so this one obviously is very geared towards students. So an approved student ID card from a state or private university or a community college. Now, this is one, there are two kinds of IDs that have to be approved by the state board before they can be used for voting purposes in our elections. And that's student IDs and that's government employee IDs. So what that involves is there is an application period. In the state board, we had one last summer, and then we had another one in between, I think it was November 15th to December 15th. So we had a second round. And so we open up an application period. Those universities, colleges, community colleges, local governments, you're talking about employee IDs, they all submit an application. It's basically just a form checking some boxes saying, yes, our IDs meet these certain criteria and we will do certain things, for those IDs, like including an expiration date on the ID. They submit that, they submit a picture of the ID, and then we review them at the staff level. They get recommended for approval or if they meet all the criteria, and then they finally get approved. And we've added that list to our website. And so that's right there. That link is pretty long, but if you go to the voter ID page, you'll be able to navigate to it. And there you can see all of the IDs that have been approved so far. And so there were exactly 100 last summer. I believe there were 15 more that were approved in this most recent round. And out of those, and that's for both schools and government employers. And so out of those, I counted them up. it looked like there were 59 universities, colleges, and community colleges that had their student IDs approved for 2024. Now, I know a common question is, uh, will there be another application period? Right now, there's not one that's planned, but also that doesn't mean there won't be in between the primary and general election. That's just something that um, we haven't turned to and haven't planned out yet. So maybe not. We'll see, but certainly if there is going to be one, we'll announce that after the primary election. Um, Either way, though, even if there's not an application period before the general election, there will be one after the general election because these IDs are essentially only approved on a 2 year basis, so or 2 year cycle. And so, what we'll have to do at the end of this year is everybody will have to reapply for their IDs to be approved next year and for the next 2 years. And so, there, if they're already approved, it's fairly simple. If the ID is not changed, the administrator submitting the application only has to check one box saying, yeah, everything's the same with with our school's ID. So hopefully, like I said, we have 59 schools. Hopefully all those schools uh, renew and then even more seek approval for the next 2 years. One other thing I just thought about for the student IDs, I know that schools are starting to turn more towards digital IDs. But right now, it's only physical ID cards that are approved. The digital ID aspect of it is something that we are certainly aware of and have been looking into to try to figure out if we'll be able to approve those. But um, we're not at the point yet where we're able to say those could be approved or not. So for right now, it is certainly is still just the physical IDs. So like I mentioned, there are just a number of IDs. Other ones that are acceptable are passports or a passport card. There's the NC voter photo ID card, which I'm about to talk about in just a minute. And then there's also military or veteran ID cards, tribal enrollment cards, ID cards issued from agencies, government agencies that have a public assistance program. And I'll say on the third one, the state board, we're not aware of one of those that has a photo. And all three of these at the bottom, the military, tribal, and public assistance program cards, those oftentimes are cards that don't have a photo, but obviously they can only be used as photo ID if they do have a photo on them. So what if I don't have any of those other cards that are out there? And this is where I was talking about the state board's voter photo ID card. So these are issued by the County Board of Elections. And one thing about elections in North Carolina is it's top down, where you have the state board kind of oversees everything. But on a local level, the County Board of Elections is administering everything about the election. They're the ones who are doing the registration. They're the ones who would be issuing voter ID cards. They're the ones who are carrying out the elections whenever you go to vote. So one important part about this is it's only the County Board of Elections for a voter in the county where they're registered who can be issuing these cards. So these cards, and I'll say I have one. I got one last year before the municipal elections. And that was mainly because I didn't need one. I have a driver's license, but my license was pretty old. And I thought, well, why don't I have, why don't I get one with an updated picture that I don't have to wait for a month to go to the DMV to get that new picture. So that was something that I did, and it was very simple. It took me just a couple minutes to get it. So how to get a voter photo ID card, and one important part, these are free. So these are at no cost. So even if your school doesn't have an approved student ID card, then students at that school who are registered to vote in that county, they can go and get one of these cards from where they're registered, and they can get it for free. So you just go to the County Board of Elections office, you give your name, date of birth, the last four of your social security number. There's a fairly simple form that asks for that information. And then you go ahead and get your picture taken, and they print the card right there for you. And then that card, it's valid for 10 years. So that's something that a student, even if they got it now, they could be using that for quite a bit of time. So with photo ID and the process of just what students can expect whenever they go to vote, and this is if they voted before, what would happen is you'd be asked to state your name, your address. The poll worker would look you up and then say, all right, you're qualified to vote. You can proceed, go to the next table and get a ballot. So now with photo ID, it just adds one more step to that. So it's not like a complete changing of the process. If you have any students or experienced voters, it's just one additional step in what they do. So now the poll worker is going to ask the voters state their name, show their ID, and then confirm their residential address. And so what I'll say about examining the ID, they're looking for two things. They're looking for making sure that the picture on the ID matches the person who is presenting it. And so that's really to confirm, is this ID the ID of the person in front of me? The other thing they're looking for is whether the name matches or is pretty close to the name that is on the voter registration record for that voter. And so it doesn't have to be a perfect match, but that is what they're looking for. And I'll say too, just specific on how a poll worker knows if an ID is an approved ID. In each voting site, the poll workers all have a 2-page document that the state board produces, and we're actually just about to send out an updated one with the additional colleges and universities and government employers who just got approved for their IDs. And so the poll workers have they have this document, and on the front it has the list of all the IDs that are allowed under the statute, and on the back it has the list of schools and employers whose IDs have been approved. And one note on that is that uh, a student ID is valid anywhere in the state. It's not the one that's been approved. It's not just in the county where that school is. And there's a question that we did sometimes get in the fall about whether it could be used statewide. And so that is something where, say you have a student who they're from Raleigh, they're going to UNC Charlotte, they're still registered in Raleigh, and so that's where they vote, and they go back home to vote. They can use that UNC Charlotte ID, and the poll workers there in Wake County are going to have the list of IDs that have been approved, and they'll see that, okay, yeah, UNC Charlotte's IDs have been approved. So after examination of the photo ID, then they'll confirm the voters registered and they'll get their ballot. So like I said, it's all part of the same process that was there before. Now, voting by mail is a little bit different. So if you have an experienced voter who voted by mail and they didn't vote in the municipal election, this will be a little bit more of a change, but it's still not too much. So before the voter would get their envelope to return the ballot in, they would put the ballot in that envelope. The envelope has their form on the outside of it, and then they would send it back. Now there are a couple envelopes that they send back. So a voter has to include a photocopy of their acceptable ID whenever they send back in their absentee by mail ballot. And we really want to make sure that that person's driver's license or whatever ID it is protected. And so what we've done is we've come up with we call it the 3 envelope process, because we have to have an envelope to send the materials to the voters. And so the when they send it back, the voter is going to put their ballot in the ballot envelope, and that's pretty much like the same one before, where it has the form they fill out on the outside of it. But on the other side of it, there is a clear plastic sleeve that they can then fold up their copy of their photo ID and put it in there. or as I'm about to talk about, a photo ID exception form, which is stating why they can't include a copy of their ID. And then that goes into a larger return envelope to be sent back to keep that private information protected. So if a voter can't include a photocopy of their ID, they can complete a photo ID exception form. And that's essentially saying, there's some kind of reason for you why you cannot comply with the photo ID requirement. In this case, generally you don't have an ID to show, or most commonly for the absentee by mail voter, it's that I do have an ID, but I can't make a photocopy of it. So, like I just mentioned, the photo ID exception form. So, can I vote without an ID? Yes. So, if your students are asking you questions and they're like, I'm just not, I don't have an ID. What am I going to do? You say, well, look, you can still vote without an ID. So voters, they can vote with or without an acceptable ID. And if you don't show, so if you show up to vote in person, then and you do not show a photo ID, then you cast what's called a provisional ballot. And so if that's the only reason why, normally you cast a provisional ballot if there's some kind of question about your eligibility, like you're not showing up on the voter registration records, and so you're saying, well, no, I'm registered here is where I should be voting. So you cast a provisional ballot and that gets researched. But here, for photo ID reasons, your provisional ballot is going to count if that's the only reason why you're casting provisional ballot. You have two options. Then you can either bring your ID to your county board of elections by the day before canvass, and so that's by the close of business. So it's really 5 p.m. the day before canvass, and so that's the ninth day after the election. There, if a student does that, they show up at the board of elections office. Staff worker is going to look at the ID, look at the person, be just like if they brought the ID to the voting site. The other thing that you can do is truthfully complete a photo ID exception form. Uh, the exception form, here's what it looks like for an in-person voter. So essentially what you do is write your name, put down your email address and phone in case there's any questions that the staff might have about your form, and then you check a box. And so I didn't have room for the full form here, but there's actually three exceptions that can be chosen. So one is having a reasonable impediment that prevents me from presenting a photo ID. And so there you just check that box. And then you pick the one that applies to you. I will say there is the other box there, and there's no limitation on what can be written there in the other on the other line, but it does need to be something that is preventing the voter from presenting a photo ID whenever they're there to vote. And the other two exceptions are a religious exception or religious objection to having your photograph taken, and the third one is if there's a declared natural disaster within 100 days I believe it's 100 days of the election. Uh, on this, another key point is no one's ever going to be turned away from the polls or told they can't vote because they don't have a photo ID. And so that's something that should never happen. Certainly if that does happen, then please contact the county board of elections or the state board of elections right away, so that way we can look into it, because certainly the whole reason for the exception form, and this is the General Assembly, that whenever they enacted the law, this was part of it, is that people without an ID will still be able to vote. So no one should be turned away for that reason. And provisional ballots are how that is accomplished. One note on the absentee photo ID exception form, and it has one additional option that's different than if you vote in person. And so that's the very first one that's there. And like I mentioned, the most common reason for that is someone's not going to be able to include a photocopy of their photo ID. And so if they do that, then they do have to include one of the two numbers that are listed there. It's really three numbers. So your driver's license, your DMV ID number, or your last four digits of your social security number. And definitely still, if your students are asking about this, just make sure they still check the box as well. That is something that we noticed. So again, resources for photo ID. I don't think there's going to be anything that's more valuable than going to our website and looking at all of that. And I know I spend the bulk of my time on photo ID, and that's because it really is probably going to be the biggest change for students, really for any voters. So pointers for college voters is the next section. And like I mentioned, this is going to be more about just registration to vote. So, in order to register to vote in North Carolina, a person must meet the qualifications to vote and complete a voter registration application. So, what are the qualifications to vote in North Carolina? First, you have to be a citizen of the United States. Second, you have to reside in the county where you register for at least 30 days prior to the date of the election. And I made that prior to the date of the election part in yellow just because that's a point of emphasis. It's not 30 days prior to whenever you register to vote. It's looking ahead to the election, and so you're just saying you need to live there for 30 days before the date of the election. So then at least 18 years old, and then you cannot be serving a sentence for a felony conviction, including probation, parole, or post-release supervision. That's something else that has gone back and forth some in the last couple of years because of litigation, but that is the rule: is that essentially someone can no longer be serving their sentence. So some college students might be 17, and if you are 17, you can register to vote and vote in a primary if you're going to turn 18 by the general election. And so a future voter can pre-register to vote up to 2 years before their 18th birthday. What to do is if the voter is if they submit that pre-registration, then essentially 60 days before the election, you kind of get activated in terms of their registration, and then that way they'll be able to vote. So that's something else that students can be thinking about if they are going to turn 18 before the fall elections. So where can you register to vote? There is, again, SABOR website. It really can direct you to a lot of places. There's even the form that can be downloaded and then turned in, but you don't have to just download the form. You can go to a county board of elections office. If you do download the form, you can mail it in. They can Students can, if they're a DMV customer, they can do so online as well. It's the only way to register online. You can't register through our website. But again, if you are a DMV customer, it's like you have a driver's license, then you could be able to do that way. So other ways, the State Board of Elections office, we have voter registration forms at our office if anybody feels like coming to downtown Raleigh to the Dobbs building. Public libraries, public schools. I mentioned the County Board of Elections, and then also voter registration drives. Those are probably going to be more common for students to be looking at. So when do students need to register to vote? So if they want to vote in the primary, which is on March 5th, then the voter registration deadline is 25 days before election day. It's February 9th. So, if you're trying to gear up for the primary, which I think is kind of the main goal for today's presentations, that's the date you want to be thinking about. And for the election in November later this year, October 11th is the deadline there. Now, even if a student misses that 25-day deadline, then voters, they can still register and vote on the same day during early voting. And they would do that by completing a voter registration application and providing proof of their residence about where they live. And then along with that, they still have to show an acceptable photo ID. So the early voting period for the primary, that's February 15th to March 2nd. And then for the general election, it's October 17th through November 2nd. And one thing I'll point out is that counties don't all have the same dates for their early voting periods. There are certain times where they have to be open, but what I would encourage your students to do is that whichever county they are registered to vote in, they should look at that county's website just to confirm when the early voting dates and times are. So residency, this is something that's can be a little tricky to think about for students just because they were living somewhere, now they're in college, they may stay in that college town, they may not. And so I'm just going to talk about a few things for them to keep in mind. So what address do I use when registering to vote? And this really goes for anybody, not just students, but the voter uses their fixed residence, which is the place where whenever that person is absent, that person has the intention of returning. And I'm just going to emphasize intention there because the intent of the voter is what decides their voter residence. And that makes it a little harder to tell from an outsider's perspective, but it's on that voter. It's just what is their intent. So if I temporarily relocate, can I still vote? The answer is yes. So a voter who relocates temporarily with the intention of returning is going to maintain their home residence. So you might be living somewhere, you're going to go stay somewhere for a few months and then come back. That's where your original address where you're going to return to, that's going to be your registration address. So what if I move to make a new place my home? Will I be able to vote based on my previous address? So there's the opposite. The answer is no, because if a voter intends to permanently move, that voter loses the residency at the previous address. And it's not just permanent, but if you're going to be staying somewhere for an indefinite period of time, then essentially you are that's where you are for the foreseeable future. And so you don't have an intent to return to somewhere else. It's to be where you are. And so that's why you would use that new address as your residential address. So college students, I attend college in North Carolina. Where do I vote? You may register and vote in the county where you are attending college if you intend to make the college community your home while you are attending school and don't intend to return your pre-college home. So that's like we just talked about. It's really just what's your intent about where you are in that moment. Are you going to be staying where you are, or do you know that you're going to be going back somewhere else? So you don't have to intend to stay in the school community beyond graduation. I'll say I know, like for me, whenever I went off to college, I knew I had no um, desire to return to my home where I grew up, and that's not because I didn't love my parents or anything. I was ready to get out into the world and be a college student, and then you know go wherever life took me. I didn't know where I was going to be after college. I thought maybe I'd go to Washington D.C. or you know anywhere other than North Carolina. So, but while I was in college at NC State, I changed my registration and I was registered in Raleigh, where I was living in off-campus housing, and that's what I used as my residential address because that's where um, I knew where if I left and went somewhere, that's what I was going to be coming back to. So if you intend to return to your pre-college home though after graduation, then you can register and vote at home. Again, that's because that's where you're going to be returning to. So you can vote absentee or return home to vote in person. The main thing for students just to be reminded of is they cannot maintain two residences for voting purposes. And voting twice in an election is illegal. And that's, not just twice in an election in the same state, but it's across states. So if you have a student from another state here, another state, and then they're here and they register to vote, they can't vote in a North Carolina election and say a Tennessee election. All right, so the last section here that I'm going to talk about is just a few changes that are coming about this year as a result of really what was this big elections omnibus session law, and so that's session law 2023-140 is more commonly known, at least in the media, as Senate Bill or SB 747. I know there were some plain comparisons just because of the size of the bill. It is quite lengthy and has a number of changes, and some of them involve things that voters won't even know about. Regulates county board or state board actions, more like procedures that we have to do. Others are certain things about list maintenance and maintaining the voter rolls. But I'm going to talk about a few that might have more of a direct impact on the voting experience for students. So, election day deadline for absentee by mail ballots, and this is one where, like I just said, if someone's registered back home and they're at school kind of far away, then what they really need to know is that before, if an absentee ballot was postmarked by election day, then it could still be received by a county board of elections up to 3 days later. It's kind of like a mail grace period almost, you can think about. Now, though, the ballot has to arrive at the county board of elections by mail or hand delivery by 7:30 p.m. on election day. So there is, even if it is postmarked on election day and it gets put in the mail, and it's received later, it's not going to count. So really, for your students, what they really just need to know is, look, put your ballot in the mail well before election day. And I'll say, this is one of the questions that was put in ahead of time, and I'll just mention it briefly here is when the ballots will be ready. And absentee ballots will be ready starting January 19th. So there is a good amount of time for if a student knows, hey, I'm going to have to, I'm not going to be in town uh, for early voting or on election day, they can go ahead and they can request their absentee ballot now. And then uh, starting on the 19th or anytime thereafter, if they put in their request, they'll get sent their absentee by mail package. So that's something for them to really keep in mind. And then, of course, really get in the mail well before election day, so that way there's less of a chance that there's any kind of mail delay that affects it. So voting in a party primary as an unaffiliated voter, I know the trends in North Carolina are that unaffiliated voters, I think, are now the largest group of, you can't really call them a political party, but they are the largest group of voters if you're breaking it down by political party or lack of affiliation. And so these are, and I'll just say, more commonly people will say independent voters. So if they're saying independent voters in North Carolina, we refer to them as unaffiliated voters. So if a student comes to ask you, say, hey, I want to be independent, but on this voter registration form there is no independent party, then you just need to direct them that it's an unaffiliated. They would want to choose unaffiliated. So before, a political party had to open up its primary to unaffiliated voters for them to be able to vote in that party's primary. And, usually they would, not all the time though. But now, because of this change in the law, unaffiliated voters can vote in any party primary of their choice. And a couple reminders on that. They can only vote in one party primary. So, you can't say, well, I want to vote for the Republican presidential primary, but the Democratic gubernatorial primary, right? So it doesn't work that way. It's only one or the other. And just the other reminder too, if you are affiliated with a party, you can't vote in another party's primary, even if your party does not have a primary. So the Green Party, they do not have a primary this year, and that's because out of all of the candidates who filed for office, none of them, there weren't enough for any contest in which a Green Party candidate filed to have a primary. And then the No Labels Party, they're a new party, and because this is the first statewide election following them becoming a new party, all of their candidates can be chosen by convention, so there won't be even a chance for them to have a primary. But if someone's registered with that party, they can't vote in, say, the Democratic or Republican or Libertarian primaries. So same day registration, and so there's 3 requirements for that. So you got to present a document with your current name and residential address and present an acceptable photo ID and then complete a voter registration application. So I mentioned that previously about that being something that students can do if they miss the regular voter registration deadline. And so the process has changed just a little bit for students. And so I'm going to talk about briefly just one of those changes. So before, specifically on the proof of residence, a student or really any person who registers at the early voting site, they would have to prove their current residence with any number of um, kind of documentation. So it could be a government ID, a utility bill, a bank statement, a government check, paycheck, other government document, a college document showing their address, or a college ID plus a list of on-campus residents from college. So that's what was allowed before. Now, though, there's one difference is that those final points for students, now you would be using a college document plus a student ID approved for a voter ID. And from that same college. So, just an important point about that is the just thinking about, that means it's not every college document. It is looking at um, those from the I think it said there were 59 schools with student IDs that were approved, and so that's just one key consideration. And I'll say, um, on our website we do have a lot of good information about that, and that kind of spells it out more too. And so I would certainly, if there are questions, refer to the State Board's website. There's a whole section about registering as a college student. So finally, the other kind of new process for same day registration is the county board is going to send a mailing to verify the resident's address. And so voter shows up, same day register, they go ahead and cast their ballot. Then the county board is going to send out a mailing. And if that comes back as undeliverable, though, then before canvass, then the ballot's not going to count. So it's really important that a person doing this, especially a student, registers using an address that can receive mail. And just one point on this further is this aspect of the same day registration is the current subject of litigation. Uh, there was a recent hearing on in federal court, and so this could change. And I can't predict what that change might look like, but I do just want to flag that for you as something to be on the lookout for. And if there is some kind of change, the state board will certainly do what we can to put out an education campaign to make sure everybody knows about those changes. So fine for students, really you can be great for them to get involved. They can serve as election officials, can be election assistants, they can be multi-partisan assistance team members where you have these groups that go out into the communities a lot of times to like nursing homes to help voters who can't make it to a voting site to vote and to do different things. So other resources as well, just again, can't say it enough, our website, it's ncsb.gov. And then there's also a phone number that you can call if there are questions. And so you'll call in, they'll take down your information, and then they create what we call tickets. And then those get routed to the appropriate people. And again, you can find that on our website as well. And then the last thing, I send this to Sam for further distribution. And so we have a voting as a college student handout. And this is something that for the schools that get their IDs approved as student IDs for voting purposes, they're required to provide these to their students. But really, it's a great resource for any educational institution to use, because it kind of lays out, how to register, your voting options, other things like that. And so that's something that Sam can also pass along. And so now I'll stop sharing my screen.